The night in Surelier was never silent. It hummed with the distant growl of Lagos traffic, the shouts of night traders, and the thump of generators kicking to life. But in the small, tidy apartment where Ifioma lived with her daughter, the loneliness had its own distinct, heartbreaking sound. It was the soft shush of a broom on the already clean floor, the too loud clatter of a single plate being washed, and the deep, weary sigh that escaped her lips the moment she tucked her 4-year-old, Neka, into bed. Tonight, like every night, Ifioma stood in the doorway, watching her daughter sleep peacefully under the pink mosquito net. Neka's face was a perfect, peaceful moon, free of the worry her mother carried like a second skin. At 28, Ifioma's face already showed fine lines of strain, not from age, but from the relentless math of survival. How much for school fees? How much for lace fabric? How much for generator fuel? She padded back to the sitting room, which was also her bedroom, and sank onto a small, worn sofa. Her eyes drifted to the one framed photo on the wall. It was her and Emeka, a handsome man with his arms slung around her shoulders. Her own smile in the photo was wide and trusting, full of a future he had painted with words like forever and our family. He'd even given her a ring, a flashy, cheap thing that turned her finger green. She hadn't cared. It was a promise. The memory cut through her like a shard of glass. The day she told him she was pregnant, his smile freezing, then melting into a panicked frown. Ife, this is not the plan. The calls that became less frequent, then stopped. The day she saw him across the market, his arm around another woman, laughing. He hadn't even seen her. That was 5 years ago. 5 years of raising a child alone. 5 years of facing whispers and judgment. 5 years of being both mother and father, provider and comforter. She was a warrior, yes. She built her lace business from a single basket to a respected stall. She commanded respect in the market. But here, in this quiet room, the armor fell away. A deep, aching emptiness opened up in her chest. It wasn't just about help. It was a craving for companionship, a longing to hear another adult voice at the end of the day, to have someone ask, "How did you do?" and truly listen. Her body, young and alive, yearned for a simple, loving touch. Hot, silent tears began to stream down her face. She had learned to cry quietly, to keep the anguish from her daughter's ears. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. "Chanique," she whispered into the heavy air, her voice cracking. "Please come. I am so tired. I am so alone." The confession, spoken aloud, was both a shame and a relief. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to do this by myself." She slid from the sofa onto her knees, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. The prayer poured out of her, a river of sorrow and desperate hope. "Send me a good man, a kind man, one who will see me, and not just a struggling woman. One who will look at Neka and see a daughter to cherish, not a burden. One who will stay. Oh God, one who will stay." In the next room, Neka stirred. She wasn't fully awake, but she heard it, the muffled, hiccuping tremor in her mother's voice that seeped through the thin wall. It was the same sound she heard many nights. The sound of her strong, beautiful mama breaking apart when she thought no one was listening. Neka clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter, a small frown on her brow. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling perfectly. It was the sound of a heart calling out into the dark, hoping for an answer that never came. And in her child's soul, a fierce and protective resolve began to harden. Someone had to make that sound stop. Someone had to bring an answer to her mother's call. If only she knew how. Stay tuned for the next part of this incredible story to see what happens next. It wasn't a loud sound, more like a soft whisper than the generator's rumble, delicate like rain tapping on a zinc roof. It was a sound woven from air and heartbreak, a hitched breath, a whisper fraying into a wet silence. Then came the low, rhythmic murmur, her mother's nighttime prayers. Neka's ears, finely tuned to her mother's voice. The cheerful market call, the patient teaching tone, the "don't make me sit again" voice, now strained to catch this new one. This was the other voice, the one that only surfaced in the dark. She heard the words, but they felt like puzzle pieces from a box meant for grown-ups. Alone, tired, a good man, stay. They floated through the wall, heavy and sad. But the meaning was in the music, not the lyrics. Neka didn't need to know what companionship meant to feel the hollow ache in the plea. She didn't know what longing was, but she recognized the sound of wanting something so badly it made your voice thin and shaky. It was the same sound she made when she desperately wanted the last piece of chin-chin at a party and saw another kid reach for it. This, though, was a big want, a grown-up-sized hole, and her mother's voice was trying to fill it with whispers, but it wasn't working. Neka's small face, usually bright with smiles and dramatic pouts, settled into a solemn stillness. Her brows, fine and dark like painted strokes, drew together. In the dim light, her eyes widened, reflecting the sliver of yellow light sneaking under the door. She replayed the day in her mind, searching for clues. Mama had been extra quiet at dinner, stirring the agusi soup but barely eating. She'd smiled when Neka showed her a drawing, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was like a sunbeam trying to shine through a thick curtain. Earlier at the market, there had been that man, the one with the loud laugh and the fancy car who called Mama fine girl and tried to touch her arm. Mama had jerked away, her face turning hard and cold as stone, her voice sharp like a slap. "I am a businesswoman, sir. Do you want to buy lace or not?" The man had driven off, muttering. Neka had felt proud of her mother's strength then. But now, hearing the other voice, she wondered if that hardness was heavy to carry. Maybe being strong all the time made you extra tired. A new, profound understanding dawned on her, simple and absolute. Her mother was lonely. It was a different kind of lonely than when Neka had no one to play with. This was a deep down, bone lonely. A loneliness that prayers and hard work couldn't fix. Mr. Hops grew damp under her clutching fingers. A fierce, protective love, as vast and uncomplicated as the ocean, rose in her little chest. It was her job to make Mama happy. Mama made her happy every day, with warm breakfasts, with stories, with safe hugs. She made the bad dreams go away. Who made Mama's bad dreams go away? The answer was a cold, empty space. No one. The murmur from the next room stopped, replaced by the soft sounds of her mother finally lying down on the floor mattress. The silence that followed was even worse. It was a silence full of the echo of the other voice. Neka made a decision there in the dark, with the geckos chirping and the distant thump of a nightclub speaker. It wasn't a decision made with words, but with feeling, a mission encoded in her heart. She had to find the thing that would make the other voice disappear. She had to find the answer to the call that went out night after night. She didn't know what it looked like or where to find it, but she knew its name. Her mother had said it in her prayer, the one word that shone like a jewel amidst the sad murmurings. A man. A good one. A kind one. One who would stay. Neka didn't know how to find such a man. The men she knew were Uncle Toby, who sold beans by the bus stop and always gave her extra, the stern policeman directing traffic, and the loud mechanics covered in grease. None of them seemed like the answer to the deep, grown-up loneliness. But the resolve settled into her bones. She would watch. She would listen. She would be ready. Her mother's tears, though silent, had sown a seed of fierce determination in her daughter's soul. The warrior's child would become a scout, a seeker, a tiny guardian on a quest to banish the sound of loneliness from their home forever. She finally closed her eyes, Mr. Hop snug under her chin. The last thing she heard before sleep took her wasn't the other voice, but the memory of her mother's laughter from long ago, a bright, free sound she realized she heard less and less. She would find a way to bring that sound back. She had to. Dawn in Lagos wasn't a gentle awakening. It was a percussion section warming up, the clatter of metal shop gates rolling open, the pre-dawn call to prayer from the mosque mingling with roosters and barking dogs, the hiss of the first kettles for morning tea. In the small apartment on Olayton Street, the day began not with a sigh, but with a silent, precise mobilization. Ifeoma was already moving in the gray half-light. The foam mattress was rolled, tied, and leaned neatly against the wall. The Kent cloth was smoothed over the sofa. In 5 efficient minutes, the sitting room transformed from a bedroom of sorrow back into a public space of order. She moved like a soldier, each action economical, practiced. She paused at Neka's door, her warrior's mask softening for a moment. She watched her daughter sleep, the early light catching the curve of her cheek, the fan of lashes on dark skin. This sight, this perfect, breathing reason, was the fuel for her fire. She whispered a different kind of prayer now, short and sharp. Strength. Favor. Sales. Then, the armor clicked into place. By 5:30 a.m., she was dressed in a crisp, functional Ankara wrapper and blouse, her hair wrapped in a matching gelly that was more helmet than adornment. She woke Neko with gentle touches and soft songs, the other voice of the night locked away in a deep vault. "Wake up, my little market queen," she'd sing, her voice now bright, an instrument tuned for the day. The sun is up and the lace is waiting. The journey to Balagan Market was a daily adventure. First, a Kiki Marwa ride, with Neko on her lap, clutching her school bag and a wrapped packet of akara. Then, a bus, where Ifeoma used her body as a shield against the press of the crowd, creating a small, safe pocket for her daughter. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, missed nothing. The pickpocket's furtive hand, the uneven pavement, the best spot to disembark. Her stall, Ife's fine lace, wasn't large, but it was a citadel. Bolts of fabric stood like colorful sentinels, shimmering Guinea brocades, intricate French laces, bold Dutch ankara. She arranged them with an artist's eye, the most expensive pieces catching the morning sun. She wasn't just a seller. She was a curator of beauty for weddings, christenings, and big celebrations. The market woke around her in a cacophonous symphony. Hawkers yelled prices, trolleys rattled, music blared from competing speakers. Ifeoma stood in the midst of it, a still point of fierce concentration. Her first customer was a harried-looking auntie planning her daughter's engagement. "This one," the woman said, pointing to a delicate Swiss lace. "How much?" Ifeoma smiled, not a submissive seller's smile, but the confident smile of a general. "Auntie, you have exquisite taste. That's the kind of quality that doesn't shout, it whispers class. For you, because I can see you know quality, 35,000. The haggling began, a rhythmic dance of offer and counteroffer. Ifeoma was a maestro. She spoke of thread counts, of durability, of how the lace would photograph under church lights. She was firm but never rude, respectful but never weak. She read the customer's eyes, her posture, the subtle tap of a finger on a price tag. When they settled on 30,000, both women felt they had won. The auntie left with her lace. Ifeoma tucked the money deep into her money belt, a small victory. This was her battlefield, and she was winning, 1 yard at a time. She negotiated with Igbo suppliers in a mix of pidgin and broken Igbo, earning respectful nods. She calmed a frantic bride-to-be with a soothing voice and a perfect alternative when her first choice was out of stock. She sent a small boy with a bottle of cold water to the elderly tailor sweating at the next stall. She built not just transactions, but a network, a community of mutual survival. Neko watched it all from her small stool behind the counter, coloring in her book. To her, her mother in the market was a superhero. She saw the strength, the command, the way people called Auntie Ife with respect. This was her powerful, beautiful mama who could make numbers obey and solve problems with a word. But Neka, at noon, Ifeoma would hand Neka some money to buy suya from the Malam just down the row. She rarely ate more than a few bites of muamua, insisting, "Mummy is not hungry." But Neka knew better. Every naira had a purpose: school fees, rent, and saving up for a better generator. The balance her mother maintained was breathtaking yet precarious. It was the tightrope walk between immense strength and hidden vulnerability, between providing everything and sacrificing everything, between being Auntie Ife, the respected businesswoman, and Ifeoma, the lonely woman whose heart longed for a partner. As the sun dipped low, casting a golden hue over the market, Ifeoma would begin packing her wares with the same efficiency she had used to unpack them. Her armor was still on, but the day's battles were over. The journey home was quieter, with Neka often dozing against her chest. Back in their apartment, after bathing Neka and prepping for the next day, the armor would finally, slowly, come off. In her quiet citadel, the warrior faced the emptiness that no market victory could fill. The balance would tip until Dawn's discipline forced it upright once more. Neka, observing and learning, started to grasp the true cost of their life: the lace, the school fees. It wasn't just measured in naira, but in the silent currency of her mother's solitude. The desire to share that burden, to bring in reinforcements for her tired warrior, grew stronger each day. A birthday palace. The morning of Neka's 5th birthday arrived wrapped in a special kind of sunlight, or so it felt to her. It streamed through the window with a golden, promising gleam, casting dancing diamonds on the floor. The usual sounds of a latent street, the yelling, the generators, the kiki horns, felt like a celebratory fanfare just for her. Ifioma had been whispering about it for a week. A proper restaurant, NWAM, she'd say, her eyes sparkling with determination, hinting at something wonderful. With chairs you don't have to share, and waiters who will say yes, ma'am to you. The preparations were a sacred ritual. Ifioma took out the yellow dress with sunflowers, the one saved for Christmas and special outings. She spent an hour on Neka's hair, parting her scalp with gentle precision and weaving her thick hair into neat, beaded cornrows that ended in cheerful yellow baubles. Each tug of the comb, each twist of the hair, was an act of love. "Today, you are a princess," Ifioma declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "And a princess deserves a palace." For herself, Ifioma wore a simple yet elegant navy blue wrapper and a crisp white blouse. She styled a matching gelly into a modest but regal look. A touch of lipstick, a rare luxury, and a dusting of powder completed her transformation. In the small mirror, she didn't just see a market woman. She saw a mother taking her daughter out in style. It was a bold act against their struggles, a proclamation that they belonged in beautiful places. The journey to the restaurant was part of the magic. They took a taxi, a real car, not a kiki or a bus. Neka pressed her nose to the window, watching the world blur by in an exciting rush. Ifioma held her hand tightly, a smile playing on her lips, the weight of the market momentarily forgotten. Calabash Delights was indeed a palace. Its doors were made of gleaming glass and wood. A blast of cool, fragrant air, AC, greeted them as a man in a neat uniform held the door open. "Welcome, madam," he said, bowing slightly. Neka's eyes grew as wide as the plates she saw on other tables. The inside was a wonderland. The floor was a mosaic of colorful tiles. Soft, melodic highlife music floated in the air, not blared from a crackling speaker. The tables were draped in white cloths, and on each one sat a small, glowing lamp. The air smelled of spices, grilled meat, and something sweet and buttery. A waiter, looking sharp in a black waistcoat, led them to a table by a large potted plant. He pulled out Neka's chair for her, and she clambered up, feeling a thrill of immense importance. Ifioma sat across from her, her posture straight and proud, but her eyes were soft as they took in her daughter's awe. "We can order anything from this side," Ifioma said, pointing to the children's section of the menu with pictures. Neka's finger, slightly sticky from excitement, landed on a picture of jollof rice and chicken with a smiling cartoon chicken drumstick. "And a Fanta, in a glass bottle," Neka whispered, as if requesting a state secret. "And a Fanta in a glass bottle," Ifioma confirmed, her smile widening. For herself, she ordered a simple plate of fried rice and a glass of water. This was Neka's day. The extravagance was for her. When the drinks came, Neka was mesmerized by the clink of the glass bottle against the rim of her glass, by the golden bubbles fizzing to the top. She took a slow, ceremonious sip. It tasted like happiness. As they waited for their food, Ifioma reached across the table and took her daughter's small hands. "Neka, my heart," she said, her voice low and thick with emotion. "5 years ago, you were the greatest gift God ever gave me. In the middle of my storm, you were my sunshine. Every single day with you is a blessing. Happy birthday, my precious girl." Tears, sweet and warm, pricked Neka's eyes. She saw love, pure and fierce, shining in her mother's face. This was her real mother, the one behind the market strength and the nighttime tears. This was the heart of their small universe. It was in this moment of perfect, glittering joy that Neka's ever-watchful eyes, scanning her new palace, landed on the corner booth. And saw the shadow. A man sat alone. He wasn't looking at a phone or a menu. He was just staring at the glass of water in front of him as if it held the answer to a terrible question. He was dressed nicely in a simple white agbada with delicate blue embroidery, but the clothes seemed to hang on him, as if he'd recently shrunk inside them. His shoulders were slumped, but it was his face that arrested her. It was a handsome face, strong-jawed, but etched with a sadness so deep it seemed to absorb the light from the cheerful room around him. His eyes, downcast, held a story of hurt. Neka knew this look. It wasn't the temporary frown of a crossed child. It was the settled, weary sadness of her mother's other voice. It was grown-up loneliness, sitting alone at a table meant for two. Her birthday joy flickered, not fading, but transforming. The scout in her, the protector, snapped to attention. Her mission, born in the dark listening to tears, suddenly had a face. A target. Her mother's laughter from a moment ago echoed in her ears, a sound she wanted to hear forever. She looked at the sad man, then back at her beautiful, laughing mother. A connection sparked in her 5-year-old mind, brilliant in its simplicity. Her mother needed a man to stop the lonely sound. This man had a lonely vibe all around him. Two lonely vibes could cancel each other out. The logic was as clear as the glass of her Fanta bottle. The plan formed in her mind felt as certain as a fairy tale. When Ifioma excused herself to find the restroom, gliding gracefully between the tables, Neka knew her moment had come. The birthday palace was about to become the stage for her most important mission. The sad man in the corner. His name was Tund. The cool, fragrant air of Calabash Delights didn't do a thing to ease the tight, hot ache in his chest. He'd picked the corner booth for its privacy, a dimly lit nook where the restaurant's festive glow seemed to fade away. Here, he could be alone with his thoughts. The glass of water in front of him was just a prop, something to hold on to so his hands wouldn't shake. He hadn't ordered anything else. The idea of food, the colorful plates being served to laughing families and couples, made him feel sick. How could he eat when the very idea of taste felt stolen from him? His mind was stuck on repeat, replaying the scene from 48 hours ago in his Ikoyi penthouse. Ngozi, wrapped in silk he'd paid for, laughing into her phone. It was a laugh he hadn't heard in months. Light, girlish, genuine. He'd crept up quietly, a smile ready on his lips, wanting to surprise her. Then he'd heard the words. "Yes, darling, of course I'm sure. The account is in Switzerland. Once the papers are signed for the Victoria Island duplex, I'll initiate the transfer. The old fool is so smitten, he can't see straight. Thinks I love him for his poetry." A snort of laughter followed. "Please. His only good poem is the one on his bank statement." Tund froze. The old fool was only 42. The poetry was something private, vulnerable, lines he'd shared only with her in the dark. It felt like a punch to the gut. He let out a low, wounded sound, and she spun around, the phone clattering to the marble floor, her eyes wide with a fear that was all about money. The confrontation that followed was a blur of hissed accusations, tears that he now knew were expertly conjured, and finally, a cold, steely defiance from her. "What did you expect, Tund? You're a wealthy man. This is how the world works." The world. His world, built from nothing, from hawking spare parts in the blistering sun of Nui to building an import-export empire, had just been revealed as a gilded cage. He'd thought he'd found a companion for the journey, someone to share the view from the top. Instead, he'd been a destination, a trophy, a balance sheet. He'd asked her to leave. The silence that followed in the penthouse was absolute, more deafening than the roar of Lagos below. It was the silence of profound betrayal, and it had driven him out, into his car, and eventually to this random restaurant in Surulere, a world away from his usual haunts. He needed to be somewhere his money held no history, no associations with her. He was adrift. The ambition that had been his engine for 2 decades felt meaningless. What was another billion, another deal, if there was no one to come home to who saw you and not the assets? He felt a fool. A rich, lonely, heartbroken fool. His gaze, unseeing, drifted from the water glass. It swept across the room, over the happy patrons, and landed, for a moment, on a vivid splash of yellow. A little girl in a sunflower dress, her hair beaded with care, sitting with a beautiful, proud-looking woman. The woman was leaning forward, saying something that made the girl's face light up with a smile, so bright it was almost painful to witness. A fresh wave of anguish crashed over him. That was what he'd wanted. Not the glamour, not the drama, but the simple, authentic connection. A family. A look of love that wasn't a calculation. He looked away, the scene too potent a reminder of what he'd just lost, or worse, what he'd never truly had. He was so buried in his own despair that he didn't notice the small movement at first. A flash of yellow entering his peripheral vision. He assumed it was a waiter. But then she was there, right at the edge of his table, a tiny, solemn presence. He looked up, startled. It was the little girl from the sunflower dress. Her eyes, huge and dark and unervingly direct, were fixed on him. They held none of a child's shyness, only a deep, unsettling assessment. She was studying his face, reading the lines of grief as if they were large, clear print. "Good afternoon, sir," she said. Her voice was high, clear as a bell, cutting through the fog of his self-pity with astonishing precision. Dazed, he managed a stiff nod. "Afternoon, little one." His own voice sounded rusty, unfamiliar. She took a small step closer, her plastic beaded braids clicking softly. She didn't smile. This was not a social call. She delivered her next line with the grave formality of a diplomat presenting credentials. "My name is Neka. It is my birthday today." The sheer, bizarre normality of the statement in the midst of his personal cataclysm was what finally snagged his full attention. He looked at her properly. She was pristine, earnest, and utterly out of place in his dark corner. A fragment of social habit, drilled into him from childhood, surfaced. "Happy birthday, Neka," he said, and the ghost of a smile, thin and obligatory, touched his lips. It felt like cracking dried clay. "Thank you." She accepted the pleasantry but swiftly moved past it. This was preamble. She drew herself up slightly, her small shoulders squaring. She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her words were not those of a child making conversation. They were a proposal, a solution. They were, though he could not know it yet, a lifeline thrown directly into his drowning depths. And as she spoke, Tund felt the walls of his self-constructed isolation begin to tremble. The fog of his heartbreak parted, just for a moment, not by the force of an adult's wisdom, but by the breathtaking, disarming clarity of a 5-year-old's mission. The proposal. Neka took a deep breath, inflating her small chest. This was it. This was the moment she could fix the sound. She looked directly into the man's sad, tired eyes, and she spoke with the absolute conviction of a child who has solved a very simple math problem. "Sir, please, will you marry my mother?" The words hung in the cool, perfumed air of the restaurant. They did not sound like a child's fantasy. They sounded, in her clear, deliberate tone, like a serious business proposition. Tund's mind, which had been a swirling storm of bitter recriminations and financial calculations, went utterly, perfectly blank. He blinked. The noise of the restaurant, the clatter of cutlery, the murmur of conversation, seemed to recede into a distant hum. He stared at this tiny envoy in the yellow dress, certain the ache in his heart had finally conjured a hallucination. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a billionaire who commanded boardrooms, who negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts with a steely gaze. He was rendered speechless by a preschooler. Seeing his stunned silence, Neka pressed on. This was her pitch, and she had practiced it in her heart every night since the sounds began. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper, as if sharing the most valuable trade secret in Lagos. "My mother is a good woman." She said it as a foundational fact, the bedrock of her proposal. "She is very beautiful." Her eyes flickered for a millisecond toward her mother's empty chair, checking the coast was still clear. Reassured, she continued, listing the benefits with the efficiency of a seasoned merchant. "She sells the best lace. She cooks the best ofen sala and her moi moi." Neka paused for emphasis, her eyes widening to illustrate the perfection. "Is smooth like pudding." She nodded once, solidifying this critical point. Good character and culinary excellence were, in her mind, the primary qualifications for marriage. Then her expression shifted. The saleswoman's pride melted into something softer, more urgent. This was the heart of the matter, the problem to be solved. "She is lonely." The word was spoken not with pity, but with clear-eyed diagnosis. "I hear her cry at night." Tund felt those words, so simply stated, pierce through the layers of his own sophisticated misery. A child hearing her mother cry in the dark. It was an image of raw, unadorned sorrow that dwarfed his own tale of betrayal among the luxury towers of Ikoyi. Neka, seeing she had his full attention, delivered the solution, the merger plan. She gestured with a small hand between him and her mother's vacant seat, physically connecting the two lonely points. "If you marry her," she said, her tone becoming practical, hopeful, "she will cook for you and take good care of you." She searched his face again, her gaze lingering on the deep grooves of sorrow around his mouth. "And you will not be sad anymore." Her logic was flawless, airtight. "You are sad. She is sad. Together, you cancel the sad. You will both be happy," she concluded, with the finality of someone stating an inevitable, natural law. In that suspended moment, Tund was not looking at a child. He was looking at a tiny, profound oracle. Her proposal cut through the complex, toxic drama of his adult life and presented a radical, innocent alternative, a partnership based on mutual need, simple care, and the promise of moi smooth as pudding. It was the antithesis of Ngozi's calculated whispers about Swiss bank accounts. He was on the verge of speech, a gentle refusal, a confused question, when Neka's sharp eyes darted over his shoulder. Her whole body stiffened. The serene negotiator vanished, replaced by a covert operative whose mission was in jeopardy. "She is coming," she hissed, her voice a urgent whisper. The fear of her mother discovering this gambit was suddenly more real than any abstract loneliness. She looked back at him, and in her eyes was a final, desperate plea that bypassed all his defenses. "Please, don't be sad. And please, don't ruin this." Then she was gone. A flash of yellow, a soft patter of small feet on tile, and she was slipping back into her chair, a picture of innocence, carefully arranging her napkin on her lap just as her mother reappeared from the hallway. Tund was left staring at the empty space where she had stood. The air seemed to vibrate with the echo of her words. "You will not be sad anymore." They weren't just words, they were an offer, an antidote. From the mouth of a babe, a prescription for healing had been issued, and it was now lodged deep in his wounded spirit. He watched the beautiful woman, the mother, the lace seller, the maker of smooth moi, slide back into her seat, beaming at her daughter. The way she instinctively brushed a cornrow from Neka's forehead radiated such genuine love that it made his chest ache in a fresh, clean way. The fog of self-pity that had wrapped around him started to lift, burned away by the unexpected clarity of a child's intervention. Sure, he was still heartbroken and still a fool, but he no longer felt alone in his understanding of loneliness. A bridge, absurd yet wonderful, had been thrown across the chasm. He glanced at the untouched glass of water, then at his own hands, which had been clenched into fists. Slowly, he relaxed them, taking a deep, shuddering breath, his first real breath in 2 days. A simple yet terrifying course of action popped into his mind. He wouldn't let this moment slip away. The little general had given her orders. It was time for the sad billionaire to finally follow a command that promised something money could never buy. A wounded heart. For a long moment after the flash of yellow disappeared, Tun stayed still. The sounds of the restaurant rushed back in. A wave of laughter from a nearby table, the clink of glasses, the waiter's polite murmur. But inside him, a different kind of noise raged. The child's words, "You will not be sad anymore," echoed against the bitter thoughts that had been stuck on repeat in his mind. Swiss account. Victoria Island duplex. Old fool. He closed his eyes, and the memory hit him, no longer hazy but brutally clear. 2 days earlier, his Ikoyi penthouse. The silence was the first thing he'd loved. After the chaos of building his empire, the penthouse high above the Lagos smog felt like a sanctuary. That night, it had wrapped him in a cocoon of happiness. Ngozi was home, moving through the open-plan living room in a silk kimono he'd bought her in Dubai. A documentary played softly on the massive screen, barely watched. He was at the marble kitchen island, pouring 2 glasses of expensive red wine, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the vintage. He'd been crafting a text in his head, a silly, romantic line about her being the best deal he'd ever brokered. Then he heard it, her laugh. It wasn't the polite, tinkling laugh she used at his business dinners. This was unfiltered, girlish, full of genuine delight. A smile crept onto his lips. He loved making her laugh like that. He moved silently on the plush rug, intending to sneak up and kiss the nape of her neck, hoping to soak up some of that joy for himself. He rounded the corner of the floor-to-ceiling bookcase. She was by the window, the glittering necklace of Lagos Island lights spread behind her. Her back was to him, phone pressed to her ear. "That's right, darling," she was saying, her voice a smooth purr of satisfaction. "The last one. The account is in Switzerland, under the shell company we discussed. Foolproof." Tund froze, the smile dying on his face. "Shell company? Once the papers are signed for the Victoria Island duplex. Yes, he's putting it in my name. I'll initiate the transfer. Should be by month's end." She shifted her weight, a hip cocked in pure triumph. "The old fool is so smitten, he can't see straight. Thinks I love him for his poetry." The derisive snort that followed felt like a physical blow. It sucked the air from the room. His poetry. The vulnerable, clumsy verses he'd scribbled about her smile. about finding peace in her presence, lines he'd whispered only to her in the dark, believing she was the one soul who saw the man beneath the money. Please, she chuckled into the phone, the sound now monstrous to his ears. His only good poem is the one on his bank statement. A low, guttural noise escaped him, the sound of a soul being gutted. The wine glass slipped from his numb fingers, exploding on the marble floor in a splash of blood-red liquid and crystal shards. Ngozi spun around. The phone clattered from her hand. Her eyes, wide with shock, met his. For a split second, he saw the real her, not the elegant beauty, but a cornered animal, calculating her losses. Then the mask slammed down, the wide, pleading eyes, the trembling lip. But it was too late. He had seen the truth. Tund. Baby, it's not what you think. Who were you talking to? His voice was eerily calm, a flat line. A business partner. About a surprise for you. The surprise being your Swiss account. He took a step forward, his shoes crunching on glass. The duplex you're having me sign over? My poetry. The last word cracked. What followed was a brutal confrontation. Her tears, which he now realized were a weapon she wielded with precision, flowed. Then came the excuses, the gaslighting. You're paranoid. You work too much. And finally, when he remained immovable, the cold, steely defiance. Her posture straightened. The tears vanished. She looked at him, not as a lover, but as a terminated contract. What did you expect, Tond? Her voice was chillingly matter-of-fact. You're a wealthy man. This is how the world works. I gave you beauty, charm, the perfect arm candy for your events. You gave me security. It was a transaction. You just didn't read the fine print. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his faith. He had thought they were building a life. She had been managing an investment portfolio. Get out, he'd whispered, his voice thick with a pain so profound it felt like dying. Fine. My lawyer will be in touch regarding the properties. She had left, taking the scent of her perfume and the last shred of his trust. The silence she left behind was total. It wasn't peaceful, it was accusatory. It mocked him. Old fool. Back in the restaurant, present moment Tund opened his eyes. The memory left a metallic taste of shame in his mouth. He was a fool. A rich, lonely fool who had confused a beautiful trap for a sanctuary. His gaze drifted back to the table with the little girl in yellow. The mother was laughing now at something her daughter said, the sound soft and true. There was no calculation in that face, only a tired, open warmth. This was a woman who worked, who struggled, who cried real tears in the dark for want of companionship, not a penthouse. Neka's proposal, which had seemed merely startling moments ago, now felt like a radical act of salvation. It was a transaction of an entirely different order. Not your money for my beauty, but your loneliness for my mother's care. It was a deal based on human need, not greed. On filling an emptiness, not a bank account. The child had seen his sadness and offered a solution made of oath and sala and companionship. She had looked past whatever his clothes might have suggested and seen only the wound. And she had a remedy. The bitterness that had crusted around his heart began to crack. Not fully, but enough to let in a sliver of light. The light from a yellow sunflower dress and a terrifying, innocent hope. The little matchmaker hadn't just proposed a marriage. She had offered him a way out of the cold, gilded prison of his own making. He watched as the waiter delivered their food, a plate of vibrant jollof rice for the girl, a simpler dish for her mother. The woman carefully cut the chicken for her daughter, a gesture of such unthinking tenderness it made his throat tighten. He was a wounded heart. But perhaps, just perhaps, he wasn't beyond repair. And maybe the mechanic wasn't a therapist or another glamorous socialite, but a 5-year-old girl with a plan, and her mother, who made moi smooth as pudding. The first step the world snapped back into sharp focus. Neka was back at her table, a picture of angelic concentration as she arranged her napkin. Her mother, the beautiful lace seller, was gliding back to her seat, a soft smile on her face, completely unaware of the seismic diplomatic mission that had just taken place in her absence. Tund's heart began to pound, a heavy, unfamiliar drumbeat against his ribs. It wasn't the frantic panic of the boardroom, but the adrenaline of standing at the edge of a cliff, contemplating a jump into unknown waters. Every instinct bred from his world of careful negotiations and risk assessments screamed at him to stay seated, to finish his water, pay his bill, and retreat to the sterile safety of his penthouse to nurse his wounds in private. but a newer, quieter voice, born from the echo of a child's promise. "You will not be sad anymore," whispered something else. It whispered courage. He saw the woman sit, her movements graceful. She leaned forward, saying something to her daughter, and the little girl, his tiny ambassador, grinned, a flash of pure, uncomplicated joy. That grin felt like an endorsement. A go-on. Before his rational mind could muster a veto, Tund found himself moving. He stood up. The motion felt too loud, too large for the calm ambience of the restaurant. He smoothed a hand down the front of his agbada, a nervous gesture. He was Tund Adeniran, billionaire, a man who commanded rooms. Yet, walking the 20 feet between his corner of despair and their table of sunlight felt like the most daunting crossing of. He was aware of his height, a somber figure, like a dark cloud moving toward their sunny spot. The mother caught a glimpse of him in her peripheral vision. She shifted slightly, her spine stiffening, instinctively tilting her body to shield her child. The warrior's guard, momentarily down during the joyful birthday lunch, was back up in an instant. When her eyes met his, they were cautious yet breathtakingly beautiful up close. They held a history of facing unwanted attention from men, and he could see her sizing him up. Well-dressed, but potential trouble. He stopped a respectful distance from their table. "Good afternoon," he said, relieved that his voice came out steady and soft. He directed his words to the woman, but his gaze flickered for just a moment to Neka. The little girl was watching him with the intense focus of a co-conspirator, her fork frozen midair. "Good afternoon," Ifeoma replied. Her tone was polite but cool, leaving the door just slightly ajar. She placed a gentle hand on Neka's arm, signaling her to stay still. "Please forgive my intrusion," Tund continued, clasping his hands behind his back to keep them from revealing his nerves. "My name is Tund." He risked another glance at Neka, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "Your daughter, she's a remarkable ambassador." Ifeoma's brows knitted together in confusion. "Ambassador?" She glanced down at Neka, who suddenly found a grain of rice on her plate intensely interesting. Tund's mind raced. He couldn't betray the child's secret. It was a sacred trust. He chose his words with more care than he'd ever used in a multi-million-dollar deal. "She just reminded me," he said, looking sincerely into Ifeoma's eyes, "that life holds unexpected conversations." He was speaking a coded truth, and the part of him that was still wounded hoped she might feel its weight. He took a leap. "I was wondering if it would be all right if I could have your number. I'd like to call you. To talk." The silence that followed was thick. Ifeoma's eyes widened slightly. This wasn't the crude catcall of a market admirer. This was a direct, respectful, and utterly bewildering request during a family lunch. Every survival instinct, every scar from Emika's abandonment, urged her to refuse. To shield herself, her grip on Neka's arm tightened a bit. But as she held his gaze, she noticed something that made her pause. The deep sadness Neka had spotted was still there, a shadow in his brown eyes. But layered over it now was raw, vulnerable hope. And something else, humility. He wasn't demanding, he was asking. He looked like a man who had been lost and had just glimpsed a possible, faint path forward. Neka, under the table, gently nudged her mother's leg with her foot. Ifeoma's lips parted. The word no hovered in the air. But then she thought of her own prayers, whispered into the lonely dark. Was this the answer? It seemed impossible, absurd. Yet, the quiet intensity of this stranger, the mention of her daughter as an ambassador, it felt like a ripple in the predictable, hard rhythm of her life. Hesitantly, almost against her own will, she heard her own voice recite her phone number, clear and low. Tund's shoulders, which he hadn't realized were hunched with tension, relaxed a bit. He fumbled with his phone, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy, and carefully entered the digits. "Thank you," he said, his words infused with gratitude that went far beyond just exchanging information. He looked at Neka again and offered a small, genuine smile. "Happy birthday once more, Neka." With a final, respectful nod to Ifeoma, he turned and walked back to his table. He didn't sit. He just picked up the bill, placed a stack of naira on the table, and walked out of the restaurant into the Lagos afternoon, the sun feeling strangely warm on his skin for the first time in days. Back at the table, Ifeoma sat in stunned silence, staring at the space where he had stood. "Mummy." Neka's small voice broke the spell. "Can I have my Fanta now?" Ifeoma looked at her daughter, then down at her own hands. She had just given her number to a complete stranger. She should feel anxious, reckless. But instead, a strange flutter, not quite fear, not quite excitement, stirred in her chest. It was the feeling of a first page turning, of a story beginning in a way she never could have imagined for herself. She picked up Neka's glass and poured the fizzy drink, her hand steady. "Yes, my love," she said, her voice a whisper. "You can have your Fanta." And as the bubbles danced in the glass, a new, tentative hope began to fizz quietly in the room, sparked by a child's bravery and a sad man's courage to take a first, fragile step. The first call to silence in the Ikoyi penthouse felt different now. It was no longer a heavy, accusatory wait, but a listening quiet. The spacious area felt less like a tomb and more like a hushed corridor before an important meeting. Tun stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the glittering city sprawled below him. His phone felt like a live wire in his hand. For 2 days, he had held the number. 2 days of battling the ghosts of Ngozi's betrayal, whispering that this was another foolish impulse, that he was just trading one complication for another. He'd rehearsed a dozen opening lines, from casual, "Hello, this is Tun from the restaurant," to disarmingly honest, "You don't know me, but your daughter offered me a job as your husband." Each one sounded worse than the last. But he kept seeing the woman's face, the cautious intelligence in her eyes, the weariness and strength warring beneath the surface. He kept hearing the child's simple, devastating logic. "She is lonely. I hear her cry at night." On the evening of the second day, as the sun bled orange over the lagoon, he stopped thinking. He pressed the call button. It rang. Once, twice. His throat went dry. "Hello." Her voice came through, polite, guarded, slightly breathless as if she'd hurried to answer. "Good evening," he said, the rehearsed lines evaporating. "It's Tund, from the restaurant." He cringed inwardly. Brilliant. A pause. He could almost hear her assessing, weighing the risk. "Good evening," she replied. Her tone was neutral, giving nothing away. "I hope it's not a bad time. I just wanted to say thank you again for not having me thrown out of the restaurant." It was an attempt at a joke, clumsy but sincere. He heard a faint, almost imperceptible exhale, not quite a laugh, but a release of tension. There was no need for security. "You were polite." "Polite," he repeated, grasping the word like a lifeline. "I'll take that." Another pause stretched, threatening to become awkward. He plunged ahead, abandoning all script. "How was the rest of the birthday? Did the princess enjoy her palace?" This time, the sound on the other end was unmistakably a soft chuckle. "She did. She talked about the Fanta in the glass bottle all the way home, and the chair that was pulled out for her. You've created a miniature queen with high standards." The ice was cracked, not broken, but a trickle of real conversation began to flow. They chatted about inconsequential things, the sudden rain that afternoon, the traffic on the third mainland bridge. He asked about her work, and she spoke not with the sales pitch he'd expected, but with the proud, detailed knowledge of a true craftswoman. The difference between Swiss and French lace, how to spot a quality Ankara by its weight and dye. He listened, genuinely fascinated. Her voice lost its guarded edge as she spoke about her trade, becoming animated and passionate. He, in turn, when she tentatively asked, spoke of import-export in the most general terms. "I bring things into the country, machinery mostly, and help other businesses get their products out." He carefully omitted the scale, the billions, the penthouse. He wanted to be judged as Tund, not as Adeniran Holdings. The conversation found a rhythm, hesitant but real. They discovered a shared love for the music of King Sunnyade, a mutual frustration with the constant power outages, a similar habit of drinking tea late at night. Then, in a natural lull, Tund found the courage to edge toward truth. "The other day at the restaurant, you must have thought I was strange, approaching you like that." He heard her shift, the rustle of fabric. "I did," she admitted, her voice softening. "But my life, it doesn't have much room for surprises. It was unexpected." "Mine too," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I was there that day because I got a painful reminder that the world can be pretty cruel, that people can see you as just a transaction." He paused, surprised at his own honesty. He hadn't meant to share so much. The silence on the line was thick, but not empty. It was a listening silence. When she spoke, her voice was low, a shared confession in the dark. I get transactions, she said quietly. And I know cruelty that pretends to be promise. In that moment, the 20 kilometers between Ikoyi and Surelier faded away. They were no longer a billionaire and a market trader, but two souls in separate rooms, each holding a phone like a lifeline, recognizing the familiar scars on a stranger's heart. They didn't dig deeper into their wounds that night. They didn't need to. The recognition was enough. The call lasted almost an hour. When they finally said good night, a warm, mutual good night, Tund, good night, Ifioma. Tund placed the phone on the glass table and walked back to the window. The city lights still sparkled, but they didn't seem cold anymore. They looked like 1,000 other windows, behind which other stories of hope and hurt were unfolding. For the first time since Ngozi's betrayal, he didn't feel alone in his pain. He felt connected by a thin, strong thread of understanding spun over a telephone line. Across the city, in her sitting room, Ifioma set her own phone down. Neka was long asleep. The usual nighttime silence settled in, but for once, it didn't feel heavy with loneliness. It felt pregnant with a new, fragile possibility. The man's voice had been kind, his laugh gentle. He had listened, and he had understood. She didn't kneel to pray her usual desperate prayer. Instead, she simply looked toward Neka's room, a slow, wondering smile touching her lips. Her daughter's birthday had brought more than just a Fanta in a glass bottle. It had, against all odds, brought the sound of a new voice into the quiet of her world. The courtship that followed was a delicate, deliberate dance, choreographed not by grand gestures, but by quiet, persistent presence. Tund understood the fragility of the trust he sought. One misstep could shatter it. He wasn't courting a woman used to luxury, but a warrior queen whose scepter was a measuring tape and whose crown was a well-tied galley. His approach was all about subtle reinforcement, not a flashy takeover. His first visit to her stall at Balagan Market was a masterpiece of respectful intention. He didn't roll up in a flashy Bentley, but in a simple, unmarked car. He dressed casually in trousers and a plain shirt. He strolled through the chaotic aisles, a tall figure somehow, making himself seem unobtrusive, until he stood before Ife's fine lace. Ifioma, in the middle of explaining the durability of a brocade to a customer, looked up and saw him. A flicker of surprise, and was that nervousness, crossed her face before her professional mask settled back in place. He waited patiently, admiring the organized riot of color and texture. When the customer left, he stepped forward. "Good afternoon, Auntie Ife," he said, using the market title with a slight, playful smile. Tund, good afternoon. Her voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes were bright, assessing. "What can I do for you?" "I have a sister," he began, the lie feeling oddly protective. "Her son is having a naming ceremony next month. She wants something special, but she doesn't know lace. I told her I know an expert." He gestured to the bolts of fabric. "Would you have time to advise a hopeless brother?" It was a request for her expertise, not a patronizing purchase. Ifioma's posture relaxed a fraction. For the next 30 minutes, she was in her element. She pulled out samples, explained motifs, and felt the weight of fabrics for him. Tund listened, asking thoughtful questions, his attention fully on her. He let her lead, letting her be the authority in her kingdom. He finally selected a mid-range, beautiful Guinea brocade, expensive enough to be a serious sale, but not so extravagant that it felt like charity. "Your sister has good taste," Ifioma said as she measured and cut, genuine pleasure in her voice. "She'll be grateful for the guidance," he replied, meaning every word. He didn't linger. He paid, thanked her, and left, the parcel of fabric under his arm. He had shown respect for her work, her space, and her time. It was a perfect first move. The next step was an invitation for chai. Not dinner at a fancy restaurant, but tea at a cozy, open-air cafe in Surelier, a place where the sounds of the city were a familiar soundtrack. They sat at a small wire table, the steam from their cups mingling in the humid air. Here, the conversation deepened. He asked about Neka, her school, her favorite stories. Ifioma's face softened, the warrior queen replaced by the devoted mother. He opened up a little more about his heartbreak, not with self-pity, but as a fact that had reshaped him. "She loved the idea of me," he confessed, staring into his tea. "The success, the lifestyle. It made me realize I had built a stage and forgotten to be a real person in my own home." Ifioma nodded slowly. I know what it is to be seen as a function, she said. A mother, a provider, a woman alone who must be either pitied or preyed upon. It is lonely to be seen as a role and not a person. Their eyes met, and in that shared understanding, the foundation of something real began to form. His acts of care were practical, almost invisible. Learning she took 2 buses and a kiki to get to market, he arranged for a trusted driver, an older, fatherly man named Gabriel, to coincidentally be going that way on days when the rain threatened. Gabriel has a sister near Balagan, Tund explained. It's no trouble. Ifioma, suspicious at first, soon appreciated the dry fabrics and the safety for Neka on those chaotic, wet mornings. He brought gifts, but they were for Neka, and they were books. Beautifully illustrated African folk tales, books about stars, about great women in history. He'd hand them to Ifioma first for approval. I saw this and thought she might like it, he'd say. He was investing in the child's mind, not trying to buy her affection with toys. Slowly, steadily, he integrated into the rhythm of their lives. He'd visit in the evenings, sometimes bringing a simple gift, a perfectly ripe pineapple, a container of suya from a famous spot. He'd sit on their modest sofa and listen to Neka read, correcting her patiently, his deep voice a calm counterpoint to her high, eager one. Ifioma watched him. She noticed how he never looked at his expensive watch impatiently, how he offered to help carry the heavy basin of water for laundry without being asked, how he spoke to her neighbors with the same respect he showed her. This was not the flashy, transient charm of Emeka. This was the steady, reliable weight of a man building something to last. One evening, after Tund had left, Neka, already in her nightdress, climbed onto Ifioma's lap. Do you like Mr. Tund, Mummy? Ifioma stroked her daughter's cornrows. Yes, my love. I do. Is he going to be my daddy? The question hung in the air, vast and tender. Ifioma held her daughter close. I don't know yet, NWAM. But he is a good man. A kind man. Neka nodded, satisfied, as if she'd known it all along. He doesn't make the sad sound anymore, she stated simply before wriggling down to go to bed. Ifioma sat alone in the quiet living room. The loneliness was still there, but it was no longer a cavern. It was a space waiting to be filled. Tund's gentle courtship was not a whirlwind trying to sweep her off her feet. It was a careful, respectful hand, extended, waiting for her to take it when she was ready. For the first time in years, she felt not hunted, but chosen. Not as a prize, but as a partner. And that feeling was more intoxicating than any grand, empty promise could ever be. The ritual remained the same. The hour after Neka fell asleep, the quiet settling over the apartment like a blanket. Ifioma would finish her chores, the soft swish of the broom, the neat stacking of Neka's school books. But the heaviness that used to descend, the physical weight of solitude that drove her to her knees, had begun to change. One evening, about a month after the first call, she found herself not collapsing onto the sofa, but sitting gently, a cup of lukewarm tea in her hands. She looked toward Neka's door, listening not for tears, but for the soft, even sound of her daughter's sleep. Then her mind, as now, in the quiet, memories began to bloom. The loneliness in the room was there, but it wasn't screaming anymore. It felt more like a gentle whisper, a fading echo. The emptiness inside her wasn't completely gone, but it felt softer. It was lined with the memory of a deep, attentive laugh, the sight of a large, careful hand gently fixing Neka's slipping hair clip, and the feeling of being seen not just as a struggling single mother, but as Ifioma. She didn't kneel. Instead, she stayed seated, hands wrapped around her teacup. She closed her eyes, and a new prayer formed in her heart. It didn't claw its way out in desperation. Chinique, thank you. The words were a soft exhale, a simple recognition. Thank you for the surprise I didn't plan. For the voice on the phone that asks about my day and actually listens to the answer. For the man who sees my hard work and doesn't try to save me from it, but just makes the load a little lighter. Her prayers had once been a shopping list for God, a man, a good one, kind, one who would stay. Now, they had transformed into a conversation of gratitude. The generic "a man" had a name now. It had a face that grew less sad with each passing week. It had hands that were learning the textures of her world. Thank you for the laughter he brings into this house. Thank you that Neka's eyes light up when she hears his voice. Protect him, Lord. Guard his heart as you are guarding mine. Let this, Whatever this is, grow in your light. Let it be real. She opened her eyes. The silence was no longer an enemy to endure, but a friendly space to hold her thoughts. The other voice, the one of raw need and aching solitude, had quieted, not because a man had arrived, but because respect, friendship, and a growing, mutual affection had taken root. From the bedroom, there was no sound, no phantom echoes of her past tears. Instead, she heard Neka's soft, contented sigh in her sleep. Her daughter, her tiny prophet, was sleeping the deep, secure sleep of a child who senses that the atmosphere of her home has changed, who feels the tectonic plates of her mother's heart shifting from desperation to hope. Ifioma finished her tea and stood up. She didn't feel the usual bone-deep exhaustion. Instead, she felt a quiet readiness for tomorrow. As she prepared her makeshift bed, her movements were fluid and unhurried. She lay down, and for the first time in years, she didn't stare at the ceiling counting her burdens. Instead, she replayed the small, beautiful moments of the day, the taste of the Ifo Rairo, the way Tund had playfully argued with her about the best football team, the weight of Neka's head on her shoulder as she read her a story. Her prayers had shifted from pleas to praise, from a cry in the dark to a whispered, "Thank you," in the growing light. And in that shift, Ifioma felt something she had almost forgotten, not just hope for a future with a man, but a profound peace with the woman she was, right now, in this quiet room, miraculously, no longer alone. Building a foundation. The relationship between Tund and Ifioma didn't explode into a passionate romance. It grew like a strong, deep-rooted tree, one ring at a time. They weren't two halves of a broken whole crashing together, but two complete, weathered individuals choosing to build something new, side by side. Tund became a student of her world. He learned the rhythms of the market, the best times to visit when the crowd thinned, which Maolam sold the purest groundnut oil nearby, so he could bring her a bottle. He didn't try to move her out of her stall, he helped her improve it. One Saturday, he showed up with a young carpenter in tow. "This is Kola," he said. "He has an idea for better shelves, so we can display more pieces without them getting dusty." It was presented as a business proposition, a collaboration. Ifioma, after some initial resistance, saw the sense in it. Together, the three of them designed sturdier, tiered shelves. Tund rolled up his sleeves, his expensive shirt forgotten, and helped sand and paint. When they were done, Ife's fine lace looked more like a boutique. Her sales increased, and her pride in her space glowed brighter. He supported her dreams without overshadowing them. One evening, she mentioned offhandedly that she had always wanted to take a formal tailoring course to expand into making ready-to-wear pieces. A week later, Tund placed a brochure for a reputable fashion institute on her table. "I asked around," he said simply. "This one has good reviews. I can watch Neka on the weekends if you want to attend the classes." He was offering a bridge, not a carriage. The choice, the effort, would be hers. For Neka, Tund became a steady, comforting presence in her life. He wasn't a playful, fleeting visitor, but a constant. He helped with her homework, patiently tracing letters with his large finger. He explained the phases of the moon with an orange and a flashlight, turning science into a bedtime magic show. He set boundaries too, gently but firmly. 5 more minutes of play, then it's bath time, he'd say, and he meant it. In his consistency, Neka found a safety she hadn't known she was missing, the safety of a second pillar in her home. One pivotal evening revealed the depth of the foundation being laid. A violent rainstorm lashed Lagos, and the power died, plunging the apartment into darkness. The old generator, as always, coughed and refused to start. In the past, this would have been a moment of utter defeat for Ifioma, sitting in the hot, dark damp, feeling the world's hostility. Neka would whimper, and Ifioma would force cheer into her voice, hiding her own despair. This time, Tund was there. Without a word, he found the flashlight, his movements calm. He gathered candles and lit them, creating a circle of warm, dancing light in the sitting room. "A camping adventure," he declared to Neka, his voice a rumble of reassurance. He pulled out a pack of cards from his pocket and taught them a simple game. In the flickering glow, they played, their laughter pushing back the shadows. He told silly stories, his voice weaving a spell of normality around them. When Neka finally fell asleep on his lap, exhausted from laughter, Ifeoma looked at him across the candlelight. He was gently stroking her daughter's hair, his face peaceful. He hadn't fixed the generator. He had fixed the fear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. He looked up, his eyes soft. "For what? Losing at cards." "For not minding the dark," she said. He held her gaze. "There is light here, Ifeoma. More than enough." It was moments like these that began to shape the unspoken future between them. They started saying we and ours. "We should get a proper fuel can for that generator. Our NECA is so clever with her numbers." Their lives, once parallel lines, were beginning to braid together. Ifeoma saw the billionaire not in flashes of wealth, but in acts of profound humility. The way he valued her opinion on everything from politics to plant and frying techniques, the way he deferred to her in matters concerning NECA, the way he carved a space for himself in their lives not by force, but by faithful, gentle attendance. He, in turn, saw in her not a project or a respite from loneliness, but a leader, a woman of immense resilience, intelligence, and love. He wasn't building a life for her. He was building a life with her. The blueprint was drawn from mutual respect, shared quiet moments, and the shared goal of nurturing the joyful little girl who had brought them together. The foundation wasn't made of granite or marble, but of shared laughter in a dark room, of sawdust from new shelves, of patient homework sessions, and of silent looks across a room that spoke volumes. It was a foundation strong enough to bear the weight of a future, and both of them, heart by cautious heart, were beginning to trust that it would. The proposal. The air in the sitting room was warm and close, fragrant with the scent of jollof rice and the faint, clean smell of the rain that had washed the streets of Surulere clean just an hour before. It was a Saturday evening, steeped in the easy, domestic rhythm they had built. NECA, belly full, was sprawled on the rug, deeply engrossed in a new picture book Tund had brought about a talking tortoise. Ifeoma was clearing the small folding table they'd eaten on. She moved with a contented efficiency, the soft cotton of her home wrapper swishing with her movements. Tund watched her from the sofa, a feeling of such profound, settled rightness filling him that it was almost a physical pressure in his chest. This was it. This was the peace he'd been chasing in boardrooms and penthouse views. It was here, in this modest room, in the quiet clatter of plates, in the sight of a child's focused brow. For weeks, he had carried the ring, a simple band of rose gold, unadorned except for a single, perfect diamond. He had designed it. He didn't get down on one knee. He took both of her hands in his, the dishcloth a damp, humble witness between them. He looked down at their joined hands, his large and dark, hers smaller, with the faint calluses of hard work, and then back up into her eyes. "You once told me you understood being seen as a function," he began, his voice low and thick. "A mother, a provider, a strong woman who needs no one." He shook his head slowly. "Ifeoma, I see you. I see the woman who fights for her daughter every single day. I see the artist in the way you arrange your lace. I see the strategist in your market negotiations. I see the kindness in how you care for your neighbors. I see the laughter you're still rediscovering. I see your strength, and I see the tender places you guard so fiercely." Tears, immediate and silent, welled in Ifeoma's eyes. No one had ever seen her so completely. "You saw me when I was a shadow," he continued, "a sad man in a corner. You and NECA, you brought me into the light. Into this light." He glanced around the room that represented her whole world. "You've shown me that a home isn't made of square footage, but of shared meals and safe silences and the sound of a child reading." He released one of her hands and fumbled for the box. Opening it, the simple diamond caught the dying light, winking with a fire that was both modest and intense. "Ifeoma, my heart, will you build a life with me? A real, true life. Not as my saved or my savior, but as my partner, my wife. Will you let me be a husband to you and a father to our NECA?" He finally sank to one knee on the linoleum floor, looking up at her, utterly vulnerable, utterly sure. Ifeoma was trembling. The dishcloth fell from her numb fingers. A sob broke from her throat, but it was a sob of joy so vast it had no other sound. She looked at the man kneeling before her, the billionaire who chose her cramped sitting room, who valued her scarf distraction tactics, who saw every scar and every strength. He was offering her not an escape from her life, but a deepening of it. A partnership. A stay. She couldn't speak. All she could do was nod, her tears falling freely now, a monsoon of released hope and answered prayers. She reached out a shaking hand and touched his cheek. It was all the answer he needed. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had always been meant to be there. He stood and gathered her into his arms, holding her as she wept into his shoulder, his own eyes tightly shut against a surge of emotion. He held the architect of his happiness, the answer to a little girl's outrageous, perfect proposal. From the bedroom doorway, Neka watched, the blue scarf forgotten in her hand. She saw her mother crying, but she saw the way Mr. Tund was holding her, like she was the most precious thing in the world. She saw the new, shiny thing on her mother's finger catching the light. A slow, dazzling smile spread across her face. She didn't fully understand the words, but she understood the picture. The sad man and her lonely mother were holding each other, and they were both shining. Her mission, it seemed, was finally, completely successful. She tiptoed back into the bedroom, giving them their moment, hugging the blue scarf to her chest, her heart bursting with a secret, triumphant joy. The lonely sound had been replaced, forever, by the sound of a promise being made and a family being born. The wedding dance. The wedding was not in a cathedral or a five-star hotel banquet hall. It was held in the sun-dappled courtyard of Ifeoma's church in Surulere, under a canopy of vibrant Ankara cloth that mirrored the joyful chaos of a Lagos block party. Ifeoma had insisted. This was where her community was, where she had prayed her lonely prayers, where she now wanted to shout her gratitude from the rooftops. She wore not an imported white gown, but a stunning, custom-made ivory iro and buba in the finest lace she had ever sourced herself, a delicate French pattern that looked like frozen morning dew. Her geli was a masterpiece, a towering coral confection that made her look every inch the queen her daughter had always known she was. Tun stood beside her in a rich, navy blue agbada embroidered with silver thread, his eyes only for her, the ghost of the sad man in the corner utterly banished. Neka, in a puff-sleeved yellow dress, was the official flower girl and chief security, a title Tund had bestowed upon her with great ceremony. She took her duties deadly seriously, scattering petals with militant precision and glaring at any small child who stepped out of line. The ceremony was a fusion of tears, laughter, and thunderous amens from the congregation. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, and Tund lifted Ifeoma's veil, a delicate piece of tulle attached to her geli, to kiss her, the courtyard erupted. The market women ululated, Tund's few close friends, real ones, vetted carefully, cheered, and Neka jumped up and down so hard her beads clacked like castanets. The reception was a feast of jollof rice, mountains of moi, peppered goat, and enough soft drinks to float a canoe. A local high-life band played, and the air thrummed with the beat of drums and the shuffle of dancing feet. It was during the father-daughter dance that the secret, held close for so long, finally breathed in the open air. The band transitioned to a softer, melodic tune. Tund, after sharing the first dance with his radiant wife, had bent down and swept Neka into his arms. Her small feet rested on his shiny shoes as he began to sway gently. To the crowd, it was a sweet, symbolic gesture. But in their little bubble of movement, a private conversation unfolded. Neka, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck, leaned close to his ear. Over the music, she whispered, "You are not sad anymore." Tun's heart clenched with love. He pulled back just enough to look into her wise, bright eyes. "No, my little general. I am not. I am the happiest man in Lagos." She studied his face, her head tilted. "Because you married Mummy?" "Because you were the bravest girl in Lagos," he replied, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. He spun her gently, making her giggle. "You know, in my business, we have partners. People we go into deals with." Neka nodded, only half understanding. "You," he said, his tone shifting to one of utmost seriousness, "are the best business partner I have ever had. You brokered the most important deal of my life." A gasp of pure, delighted understanding escaped her. Her eyes went as round as the plates of chin-chin on the tables. The secret, their secret, was out in the open between them. He knew. He had always known. And he was thanking her. A grin of unparalleled triumph spread across her face. "So I did a good job?" "The very best," he affirmed, hugging her close again. "You saw a problem, and you found a solution." That is the mark of a true CEO. She buried her face in his shoulder, her body shaking with silent, joyful laughter. When she pulled back, her expression was smug and satisfied. I told you she makes good moi. Tund threw his head back and laughed, a rich, full-bodied sound that drew smiles from everyone watching. The very best, he agreed again. He continued to dance with her, this tiny girl who had altered the constellation of his life with a few fearless words. As they moved, he looked over Neka's head at his wife. Ifeoma was surrounded by her market friends, laughing at a story, her new ring flashing on her hand as she gestured. She caught his eye and blew him a kiss. In that moment, surrounded by community, by the tangible proof of God's bizarre and wonderful grace, Tun knew the full circle was complete. The lonely billionaire had been rescued not by another adult's wisdom, but by a child's pure heart. The proposal that began in a quiet restaurant corner had reached its glorious, noisy, perfect culmination under the buzzing Lagos sun. He set Neka down gently as the song ended, and she immediately scampered off to find her friends. Tund made his way back to his wife, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into him, her head on his shoulder. "What were you and my daughter conspiring about over there?" Ifeoma asked, her voice teasing. Tund looked down at her, his eyes soft. "Just appreciating the brilliance of the women in my life," he said, and kissed her forehead, letting the secret linger a little while longer as their own precious, shared truth. The music swelled again, and they joined the dance, a new family, woven together by loneliness, courage, and a little girl's unwavering resolve. Years later, the scene was a different kind of warmth. The sprawling, sunlit kitchen of the house in Akeja was a far cry from the two-room apartment in Suralere, but its heart was the same. The air was rich with the sizzle of suya from the grill on the veranda and the sweet, yeasty scent of chin-chin fresh from the oil. It was a Sunday evening, and the Adeniran family was hosting a loud, joyful dinner. Ifeoma's market friends were there, now business partners in her thriving boutique. A few of Tun's closest, long-trusted associates sat alongside them. And at the center of the long table, now a poised and lively 12-year-old, was Neka. The conversation was a lively tapestry of old stories and new jokes. Mr. Balagan, Ifeoma's oldest supplier, was regaling the table with a tale of her early, fierce haggling days. "This small girl," he boomed, pointing a suya stick at Ifeoma, "would argue over 50 naira like it was a matter of life and death." "Because it was, uncle." Ifeoma shot back, laughing, her hand resting comfortably over Tun's on the table. The rose gold band was now joined by a simple wedding band, both worn with the easy grace of daily love. As the laughter subsided, Tund, his face softened by years of genuine happiness, raised his glass of Chapman. "I have a story," he announced, his eyes twinkling. "A story about the best business deal I ever made, though I didn't know it at the time." The table quieted, curious. Ifeoma looked at him, a fond smile on her lips, unaware of the precipice they stood upon. Tun's gaze settled on Neka, who was watching him with a slow, dawning awareness. "It happened in a restaurant," he began. "I was sitting in a corner, nursing a heart so broken I thought it might never beat properly again. A woman I thought I loved had just revealed she was only there for the poetic lines on my bank statement." A ripple of understanding went through his friends. He continued, his voice drawing everyone in. "I was convinced love was a transaction, and I was a fool. And then, out of nowhere, a little hurricane in a yellow sunflower dress marched up to my table." He nodded toward Neka, whose cheeks were beginning to flush a deep pink. She introduced herself, told me it was her birthday, and then, with the seriousness of a managing director, she presented a proposal. He paused for effect, his eyes locked with his daughter's. "She asked me to marry her mother." A collective gasp went around the table, followed by bewildered chuckles. Ifeoma's smile froze, then transformed into utter shock. Her head swiveled between Tund and Neka. "What?" She listed the benefits. Tund went on, a lump in his throat even now. "Her mother was a good woman. Beautiful. She sold the best lace and made moi smooth as pudding." He glanced at Ifeoma, whose hand had flown to her mouth. "And she was lonely. She cried at night. This little general believed that if I married her, we could cure each other's loneliness." The room was utterly silent. Ifeoma was staring at Neka, tears springing to her eyes as 1,000 puzzle pieces from that long-ago birthday Neka's odd intensity, her sudden quiet when Tund approached, the mysterious ambassador comment, clicked violently into place. You, Ifioma whispered, her voice trembling. You did that. Neka, caught in the spotlight, bit her lip but held her head high, nodding once. Tund reached for his wife's hand. She scampered back to you just as you returned from the restroom. And because of her bravery, because she looked at a sad stranger and saw a solution for her mother, I found the courage to walk over and ask for a number. The rest, he said, squeezing Ifioma's hand, is our history. The table erupted. There were shouts of laughter, exclamations of amazement, tears from Ifioma's friends. Omo, see strategy, one of the market aunties yelled, wiping her eyes. Ifioma stood up, her chair scraping back. She wasn't looking at Tund anymore. She was looking only at her daughter. She walked around the table and pulled Neka up into a fierce, crushing embrace. All the years of lonely nights, the desperate prayers, the struggle, they converged in this moment of stunning revelation. Her answered prayer had not been a mysterious act of God dropping a man from the sky. It had been engineered with pure, childish love by the very gift God had given her first. My brave, brave girl. Ifioma sobbed into Neka's hair. My little savior. Neka, finally free of the wonderful secret, hugged her back just as tightly. I just wanted you to be happy, Mummy. I just wanted the sad sound to stop. Over their embrace, Tund watched, his own vision blurred. The story was out. The full, miraculous, hilarious, and profoundly beautiful truth was laid bare. The lonely billionaire and the lonely mother, brought together by a tiny, matchmaking CEO who had brokered a merger of hearts. As the noise settled into a warm, chattering hum of awe and celebration, Tund raised his glass again. This time, his voice was thick with emotion. To Neka, he said, the architect of this family, the one who taught me that the most valuable mergers are not of companies, but of souls. To Neka, the table echoed, glasses clinking. And in the heart of the laughter and the tears, the Adeniran family was cemented not just by love, but by the truth of its extraordinary, ordinary beginning. A beginning born from a child's listening heart and a simple, world-changing question in a restaurant corner. The lonely sounds were gone, replaced forever by the rich, symphonic noise of a family, fully known and fully loved.